fight harder than you've ever fought before. I don't want to get caught riding dirty. Do you? I want to glorify God. I want God to find me swinging the sword. That's
right.
what I want.
There are many people who are looking for courageous and bold leadership. Many of our men today have been neutered and chewed up and spat out by feminists in the culture, and men are afraid to speak up. But people respond when men stand in their rightful place. God gave the role of protecting and providing and shepherding and being willing to even die for your spouse. You know, that role was given to the man. It was given to God's design of headship and leadership. But today, what we're seeing is that men have abdicated their role and responsibility. The Bible tells us that the glory of the man is the woman. But today, we see men trying to rob women of their glory because they want to be the glory. And so we have this switching and shifting of roles where men think that they can become women and women think that they can become men. And so God has raised me up to address these issues, in particular to make sure that our children in this nation are not mentally raped. Some people call it grooming, but I call it mental rape, to place filthy material at the fingertips of children.
6 perverted LGBTQIA plus folks in Roxbury High School. I will read from one of them entitled Lawn Boy. It says, what if I told you I touched another guy? I said, what if I told you I sucked it? Well, I'd say, what if I was 10 years old, but it was true. I put Doug's in my mouth. I was in 4th grade. It was no big deal. What benefit is a blowjob to a child who's preparing for the ACT or the SAT?
We have perverts that are perverting our kids. And you all sit back smug in your chairs, but you don't want me to read it. Why? Does it bother you? Yes or no? You can't answer that question. You want to know why? Because politically speaking, you can't say that it's wrong. And you don't want me to read the filth because it exposes the truth. How dare you tell me to stop reading it?
Filthy material at the fingertips of children and allow them to induce and ingest all kinds of ungodly things as early as the age of 5. That's mental rape. And it's time for the church to stand against these things.
If I look at a man whose wife is seeking to take on roles that are outside of that which God has given her, it is oftentimes a reflection of the fact that the husband has walked away from the responsibility that God has given him, and thus that woman does not feel the value that God has made her to be. And so as a result, you see that kind of role reversal where you end up seeing the exploitation of each and every single one of these roles. And by the way, the greatest victims of that end up being the children, like you said. When you see a woman demanding her rights to be treated like a man, that's very likely because that woman has never had a man in her life that has treated her the way that God has called her to be treated. And that's like the weaker vessel. And when I say the weaker vessel, not in the fact that they are physically weaker, although an overwhelming majority of the time that is true, it relates to the fact that they are a precious gem that should be treated with a certain level of fragility that demonstrates their value to the rest of the world. And within a culture, when that becomes minimized, you begin to see this. And it's a direct result of the fact that people have walked away from their God-given calls because they've walked away from God. Perhaps the greatest definition of toxic masculinity is when a man chooses to assume a role that God has not called him to step into. When he acts like a woman or pretends he's a woman or pregnant, or that is what you would call toxic masculinity.
The culture is shaming men out of being masculine, and it's shaming women out of being feminine. And so we used to have this mindset in America where, you know, anything that a man can do, a woman can do better, right? That was the general framework and the conversation. And I think men got so competitive to the point that they said, you know what, we're gonna beat you, and we're gonna start putting on dresses, and we're gonna put on fishnet stockings, and we're gonna put on high heel pumps, and we're gonna get our nails and makeup done. We're gonna create what you call cosmetic femininity, right? Because at the end of the day, the costume does not make you a particular sex.
Yes.
When God presented Eve, she was naked. And it didn't take a red dress, some perfume, some fingernail polish, and some Chanel No. 5 perfume in order for him to recognize that this was something that was different. No, he could see externally with his eyes that this was bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, and what God had done is so wonderful that Adam replied and said, "Whoa, man."
Yeah.
Woman, right?
Amen.
And so I embrace that. And I think that it's imperative for us to do that more and more as we see the dawning of the day coming of our Lord's return, because the only people who should be speaking up the loudest in this culture, fighting against the redefining of roles and sex, the primarily speaking, the main ones that should be speaking up is men.
Yeah.
Men. Of course, women can speak into the issue, but we need to hear the raspy, assertive, not so friendly at times, male dominant voice, right? We need to hear that. And what I'm seeing as I go to school boards around the country, I am awakening sleeping giants. I am inundated with messages from men who are saying, you know what, brother, man, I've been idle for too long. I thought the role of education was solely left up to my wife. And I felt that since she was the mama bear and I'm the papa bear, that I didn't have a place in the educational experience of my child. But I have men who are saying to me, hey, send me some notes, send me some ideas, send me some concepts. What can I say when I go to my local school board? Because I want to do what you are doing, John. This movement that I'm launching is bigger than me, right? It's bigger than just one man speaking up at school boards. If it's just me, then I have failed woefully. But I'm looking for Davids and Jonathans. You know, there are 3 kinds of leaders: Davids, Jonathans, and Sauls. Saul, when it's time to present himself as king and be the leader, he's going to hide. I'm not looking for the Sauls out there. Your Jonathans have the right to the throne, but they are willing to submit themselves to a David because they admire, someone who has bravery and a person who's a man of valor. Sometimes your Jonathans are not natural warriors, but they will fight if they're linked up to the right person. And then you have your Davids who go down to the valley of Elah and they said, man, who is this uncircumcised Philistine? And David is willing to run to the battle. I'm calling for the Davids. I'm calling for the Jonathans. And Saul, you can stay home. But we need these individuals today speaking up as never before.
People ask me this all the time. They say, James, why do you get involved with school boards? You're homeschooling your children. And my answer is the same every time, because that's where the battle is at, right? Although I believe that as parents, we should be educating our children at home, I also think that we need to be fighting on this battlefront. And perhaps the most significant variable that exists in wanting to be in this fight is understanding the way totalitarianism deploys itself. By the way, totalitarianism is a function of satanic principle. It is a satanic movement that is designed to cause people to void themselves of the truth and then be controlled by a lack of it. And what happens with totalitarianism is if we can target children and effectively keep parents from getting involved in defending them, then we can do anything. And that's really what happens. And so that's why at the school board meetings, we have to tell the truth. sometimes it has to be a very ugly truth, but we have to say to them. I was at a Long Beach Unified School District board meeting where I was standing amongst a majority of black school board members and actually officials. And I basically said, I'm not even going to make this about the fact that you put an abortion center in the middle of a school. If you want to talk about racism and you want to talk about racial equality, consider this one variable. The concern that I have with the association of a well-being center with an organization like Planned Parenthood is deeply concerning to me. It's deeply concerning to me for a lot of levels. Perhaps one of the levels that I should speak to, besides the preservation of life and some of the other major concerns that are very obvious that go with that, may perhaps be with the issue of racism, which is something that we've been struggling with for a considerable amount of time. The founder of Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger, when she finally came back to the United States in 1916, after being basically someone fleeing from the law, came and founded Planned Parenthood with the sole purpose of eliminating the black race. She says it's on record. And what perhaps concerns me more than anything is the fact that 3% of the childbearing population that lives in this country, 3% are black women, yet they account for 50% of the abortions that are taking place in this country. That is remarkably egregious. It is absolutely racist. It is completely inappropriate. And I think it's even more astounding, eye-opening, and remarkable to me to consider the fact that we are launching this well-being center in the school that I understand has the highest population of black students. Perhaps what we need to focus on are the relationships that exist within families that profoundly affect the behaviors from a sociological perspective that exist within children and as they mature. I think we need to start developing communication mechanisms that bring people together as opposed to the critical race theory idea that continues to divide and bring people into a different perspective. I speak from the perspective of a mother and father who gave me the opportunity to be born and raised in the greatest country in the world, and I adamantly hate and oppose racism. I think racism is destructive. I think it's evil. I think it's remarkably hateful, and that's why we have an obligation as educators to make sure we thoroughly vet what organizations we make associations with, particularly Planned Parenthood. And you say you want to avoid racism, you are targeting black men and black women and black babies. That's what you're doing.
Yes.
And it's a terrible picture. And I oftentimes like to do this, and I do it again and again and again, and it angers people, oftentimes on the left. It makes them very, very mad, and it actually angers people that consider themselves to be virtuous people. I show them this picture right here. And this picture to me speaks volumes of what it looks like. When this first case in Mississippi was filed by the Attorney General, God bless her, by the way, this story came out, and this picture says it all. Look at this, bro. You see the two people that are wearing the attire that says clinic security? Okay.
Yes.
Imagine if you changed their attire to a white robe with a pointed hat.
Come on, brother.
And
Preach
you're
it.
walking that black woman over for her baby to be hung and eventually for her to be hung. That's exactly right. What that is, bro. That picture speaks volumes of the world in which we live today. In a world that says, oh, we're going to be obsessed with race, that has to be one of the most racist things I've ever seen. Yet they look at that and they call that virtuous. That's the jacked up world we live in right now, bro. And the problem is we have men that are too scared to speak that way. They're too scared to be labeled. They don't want to be labeled as racist. Listen, call me racist all day as long as I'm telling the truth.
Right.
It's a ridiculous thing. And when are we going to open up our eyes and recognize we are in the last days? Christ could come at any second, and that doesn't mean just throw it all away. It means fight harder than you've ever fought before. I don't want to get caught riding dirty, do you? I want to glorify God. I want God to find me swinging the sword. That's right. What I want.
That's right. And they that know their God will do great exploits.